Okay. So, oh wait, let me mute everybody. So, welcome everyone. And today we're doing this Gemara on Daf Kuf. It's actually very important Gemara, especially the long Tosfot, which is really critical. Lays out a lot of the foundation principles of what we're going to call Hanan. And that's going to be, of course, a major topic throughout all of what we're learning. So let's jump right into it. And the first part of the Gemara is really not so much to do, is not that relevant. There is a siman about it, so it's worth looking at, but it's not my main focus. But maybe Reuven, you'll start us off with the beginning of the Gemara on Daf Kuf. V'ken chaticha shenevel.
Oh, what an honor. All right, I'll give it my best shot. V'chen chaticha shel nevela. And similarly for a piece of nevela. So basically, so in the case of...
So actually what you have to do is turn back 3 pages and the Gemara and look at the Mishnah. Because it's hard to, it's actually referring to the continuation of that piece of Gemara. But let's look at the Mishnah. Let's spend a little time actually on the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is on Daf Tzadi Vav Amud Beit. And there's a Mishnah there. We'll start with, so now I just wanted you to start off there and realize that you have to go to the Mishnah.
So do you want me to take the Mishnah from the top?
Yeah, take the Mishnah from the top. Wait. So what's the case? First of all, what is the first case?
So I guess it's a dish in which there was a gida nashi, so that was cooked within it.
A dish? Yeah, okay.
Is it like the leg itself was cooked without removing the ghee?
Yeah,
is that the idea?
I don't think, right. You got that, Reuven? I think it's just like you took the yerech and you cooked it without removing the gid. And the gid, of course, is forbidden. Right. So now what's the din of that yerech? You probably cook with...
So like, I guess if the gida nashi gives it a taste, give it a flavor, so then the whole leg is forbidden.
Right. Okay, go on.
So how do we calculate that? Kibasar belefet. 1 second, let me just look at Rashi.
Yeah, so there's an important Rashi here. Read the Rashi.
Just 1 second, sorry. The fire alarm just went on. Sorry, I'll be right back.
Okay, no problem. Here, all right, so let me tell Yavni to keep, have Yavni continue. Yavni, you continue. All right, you're sure you got to stop.
Sorry, take it from Ketzad Mesharinota Kebasar Balefet. How do we estimate? How do we know if it gives flavor? We imagine that it is like meat in a turnip.
Yeah.
Gid anashesh שנתבשל עם הגידים. You're back, Jonah.
Yeah, sorry for that. Like
But Yavni, you do the Rashi. You do the Rashi.
The Rashi?
Yeah, you do the Rashi.
כבשר בלפת?
Yes, כבשר בלפת, yes.
רואים כאילו הירך רואים כאילו הירך לפתות הגיד בשר, ואילו היה נותן לפתות והגיד בשר, ואילו היה נותן טעם. So we look at it as if the limb was turnips and the gid was meat.
Wait. Yeah, exactly right. I don't know why you say the limb, the thigh.
The thigh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I got confused. The thigh is as though it's turnips, and the gid, the tendon, is basar. And if the basar would would put flavor into these
If you had such a
turnips.
dish, would you be able to taste the basar in the turnips?
Right. Presumably, I mean, I'm just going to give like a way of reading the Mishnah, but presumably because gid has no flavor, we can't actually ask a Gentile to taste this thigh for us because the gid has no flavor. There would be no flavor there.
We know.
Yet it's still usr.
And basar.
What?
It's also just
Or-
mean it's the same type of piece. The gid is in the yeref. I think the idea is you just wouldn't taste it because it's min b'mino.
Okay, or possibly because it's min b'mino. That's also possibly an explanation. I would, but not necessarily so. The gid is the same min, but maybe it is. So in any case, its flavor is not detectable because either it has no flavor or it has the same flavor, and therefore we have to do this. We have to do this ro'im oto, right? We have to visualize as though it were meat and liftot and turnips. And if that would give flavor, then we know that this is usr because this would theoretically give flavor. By the way, you might learn it differently. You might learn, it's not imaginary, but he's saying maybe the rabbis actually would do an experiment. They would cook a little bit, if you could, cook some meat and put it in lifit and see if that amount of gid in that amount of thigh would give flavor and taste that. And then if it doesn't, by the way, that's another reason why you might do it like that, because that would be mutter to taste. This you couldn't taste, right? Maybe we have another way of evaluating mixtures where we say, make a new mixture on the side with meat and lefit, and then see if the flavor goes in. And then if it does, if it doesn't, then you know that your other mixture, which you couldn't taste because it had an isser in it, is actually mutter.
But Rabbi, you can maybe read it even in a simpler way. In a world that people don't eat meat that much, you know how much meat you need to make a dish.
Well, that's the normal way of reading. Yeah, the normal way of reading is that somehow we just know how much meat in lefit flavor, how much meat gives flavor to lefit. But
it's a
that's
minimum.
kind of weird, though. That's kind of weird, especially if you don't eat a lot of meat. Then how would you really know exactly the amount? You know, one more tablespoon would give flavor, and one less tablespoon wouldn't give flavor. It's kind of very difficult.
That's part of the point.
It's interesting following on last.
It's like kizait. It's not. It doesn't need to be exact in the end.
It's also
Well,
like
I'm just suggesting that it could be empirical. Yeah, Lexi, what do you want to say?
Like it's interesting following on last week, right? Because last week we were talking about the shir beetle, the shishim and the mea, and we see that like that only really gets standardized later on, right? Like actually in a lot of the Tanaitic material, we see different kind of ways of measuring beetle that are not just like stam numbers here. Like this is clearly, they could have just said b'shishim, but they don't. They say you have this other measure of like obviously the amount of meat it takes to give flavor to turnips, like.
Right, but I'm saying, but what is that measurement? Is that right? Exactly. Is that a measurement that somehow every housewife knows exactly how much meat, how much flavor meat gives, or is it something you actually experiment with? Anyway, it's not really a side point. Let's go on in the Rashi.
I mean, at least the way I read it is that it's an exact measurement that everyone knows about. Like the fact that they use as
That's the way everybody reads it. That's the way everybody reads it.
Certain standard. Yeah, there's a certain standard to it.
Yeah, that's the way everybody reads it. I'm suggesting my job is to come up with new ideas. So that's the way everybody reads it. That's the standard way of reading it. That it's like somehow we just know that 2 grams of meat in 100 grams of lefit gives flavor, and then or doesn't give flavor, but 3 grams do. We just know those measurements. That's the normal way to read it. But perhaps you actually did the experiment. Anyway, go on. I mean, the first reading is correct because of Ro'im. Ro'im sort of says you imagine, but it seems very difficult to me how you imagine this. But anyway, go on, Gavni. I want to finish.
It also seemed a little odd to me, like that the assumption, like I know that it says basal belefet and not lefet bebasal, but like if you're looking for I don't know that much about like organs, but it seems to me like maybe like it would be natural to say that a lefet is sort of the consistency of a gate tendon or whatever, as opposed, whereas the meat is the meat. That
no,
seemed
because
like more not. It seemed like
no, you have to think about it like this. Think about it like this.
Mhm.
The lefet is before they discovered potatoes. in the 1500s. So lefet was the potato. So lefet is like a very bland vegetable, and we're
Right.
seeing if meat will imbue flavor into it, and if it
Right, but
wouldn't
exactly, but
even in lefet,
But we
then
also say that the ghee is bland, right? We say that the ghee
yes, that's why we
doesn't give
can't measure.
flavor.
That's what I was saying. That gid doesn't have a flavor, and maybe that's why we can't actually taste it in this case, and therefore we make an imaginary comparison, and we say, well, what if it did have flavor? Would it give flavor to lefet? And therefore we imagine it's meat.
Right. But like, if I were just looking at the Mishnah and I might say like, oh, they're trying to look for an analog to, right, they're trying to look for like a legal analog that they could actually eat.
Exactly.
To experiment with, and so they're going to take something that's similar to a gid and put it in something that's similar to meat. Well, they're actually going to use the meat.
No, but they
and
can't
they're
take
gonna say
something
rather
similar.
than
But they can't take something similar to gid, as you said, because gid has no flavor.
I think, as per Lexi's point in the chat about it's strange to use such a combination of things, that one of which is very flavorful and one of which is very non-flavorful. Seems like the idea is we want to be very, very careful about not eating gid and asha. So we could say, okay, if something this big wouldn't even, if it were
Exactly.
meat, wouldn't even give flavor to a flavorless thing, okay, in that case, fine, the gid and asha probably hasn't. But if it's possible that, and he's right, that's the only way in which we know it definitely didn't give any flavor.
Exactly. We're being extra machmir, we're being frum. We're saying if even meat won't give flavor to this bland potato of that ratio, then for sure gid is not giving any flavor. Exactly. That's why we're taking that case, because we're trying to take the what they call the firmest common denominator. In other words, the strictest possible way of viewing it. If I misused that phrase, but okay. But so let's go on. And then it says, "Ve'ilu haya noten tam habasar kishiur bagid, bashur agid belefet." And
but
if the meat would give, so here you see it's very clearly that he's not doing the experiment. If the gid would give flavor if the meat would give flavor to the lefet, then asur. Go ahead.
asur the shiurin halacha leMoshe miSinai. And then it's asur, and like where do we get this whole thing from? This is we've received it from halacha leMoshe miSinai. So received.
So
tradition.
wait a second. This is a huge thing that everybody overlooks. Rashi is now saying, we all know the general rule that shiurin are halacha leMoshe miSinai, like that a revit is enough for kiddush, but here he's saying that also this measurement is in that category. Also, the measurement of basar in lefet is a halacha leMoshe miSinai. What? That's crazy. That's what Rashi's saying. That's halacha leMoshe miSinai.
Well, right.
Isn't
Well,
that kind of going
next
against your reading? Sorry.
What?
I'll go for Yavni.
I was gonna say the next part sort of suggests that not exactly this is halacha.
Right. Uve gamiri. What does gamiri mean?
And we deduce, we learn the bahachi misharinan that we estimate davka with the lefet af al pi she'ilu haya kruv or kaplut haya tzarich pachot or yoter.
Right. In other words, if it would be some other vegetables, we might come out with different results in our mental experiment.
Right.
But doing it with this one is what God commanded Moshe. We're not supposed to use kruv. We're supposed to use basar v'lefet. Halacha leMoshe miSinai. Now, there's a Rashi, which I don't have in front of me right here, but this Rashi is saying, wait a second, is the next Rashi? Well, right. In the next Rashi, there are two Rashis there. He says 60. In the end, what Rashi says is that this is all before we have the idea of 60. But if 60 is really just a fill-in for basar belefet, then that would imply that 60 is halacha Moshe Sinai. In other words, by extension. Perhaps the rabbis did a bunch of experiments and came up with basar belefet. The ratio is 1 in 60. They tried it with 59, they tried it with 61, and they came out with 60 as being exactly the gvul. And then it would come out that also is halacha Moshe Sinai, at least in a sense that it's the equivalent of halacha Moshe of the halacha Moshe Sinai, which is basar belefet, which is very interesting.
But if that were the case, how would we ever have a machloket about whether it's 60 or 100? And why would we need the drash?
Well, right. So according to Tosfot, that drash is an asmachta, right? All that drash is an asmachta. And then it could come out that, first of all, how did they get to the 60? How has that equivalence been created? How did they determine that 60 is equal to basar belefet? Either they did it through experiments, or maybe they did it through a drasha. But maybe the drasha is just, first, it could be that the 100 is a chumrah. In other words, the 100 is it's all in a smachta, and the 100 is saying, but we're even more machmir than the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But I agree with you. If it's halacha Moshe Sinai, according to the Rambam, there shouldn't be any machlokot about it. But that drasha could be a smachta.
Well, the halacha Moshe Sinai is basar belefet, right? What it is, it's open to experiment. And I guess some authors could be like, okay, it's 1 in 60, and some other ones were like, no, we did the experiment, it's 1 in 100.
Right. It could be, exactly. It could be like that. Except that the drasha that we learned last week seems to imply that it's based on a particular Torah permission about ratios regarding a zroa. But anyway,
it's just a drasha.
Yeah, but it could be just a drasha. Well, according to Tosfot, I tried to argue that it's D'oraita maybe, but let's go on. Anyway, this is just amazing. Rashi has a lot to say about it. So go back to the Mishnah. Reuven.
כבשר ולפת, כי דנשה שנתבשל עם הגדים, בזמן שמכירו בנותן טעם. So a gid anashe that was cooked with other sinews, I'm guessing, or other nerves, b'zman shemakiro, when you know which one is the gid anashe, so then it's asur benoten tam. So like the rest of the dish or the rest of the nerves become asur only in case where the gid anashe kind of gave flavor.
Right.
V'im lav, and in case it hasn't given flavor, kulam v'im lav, and if we don't know which one is the gid anashe, kulam asurim. We just scratch out the whole dish, like every nerve in the dish is asur. Varotev, and the sauce benoten tam, and the sauce is only asur benoten tam. Similarly,
look at Rashi. Kulan asurin. Why are kulan asurin?
ואם לאו כולם אסורים, דבכל אחד יש לומר
No,
זהות.
Rashi.
דבכל אחד יש לומר זהות, that's the one, no?
No, I wanted to say, not im lav, before that.
בנותן טעם.
Kulan asurin, v'lekaman mifaresh, and later it explains, denoten tam b'min b'mino, she'en adam yachol lavchino shiuri hu b'shishim. That when it's 60, when it's min b'mino and you cannot taste the flavor, then you permit it if it's 1 in 60. So what does it mean here, kulan asurin?
Sorry, I don't see that. I actually have benoten tam, and then afterwards we have kulam asurin.
It's right under.
I have benoten tam, and then I have kulan asurim, and then I have im lav kulan asurin.
So I'm guessing my Gemara doesn't have that one. בכל אלו kulan asurin, וכמה מפרש נותן טעם במימינו, שהאדם יכול להבחינו שיעורים ב-60. Is that it?
That's it, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, anyway, let's go on. So maybe that's not so important. So back to where we were. Wait, let me read the Mishnah again from the beginning, because I'm already getting a little bit lost. And if I'm lost, then maybe somebody's lost. So let me read it again. Yerek shenitbashel ba gid hanashe im yesh ba benoten tam harezu asura. If it has So if you can taste the flavor of the gid in that yerech, then it's asur. Ketzad misharin, how do we know? Because we can't taste it ourselves. Ketzad misharin oto, kebasa berlefet. We imagine it, or we experiment that it's like basa berlefet. Gid anashe shenipasheli magidim. What about gid anashe that was cooked with other gidim? Bisman shemekiro, when you recognize the gid anashe, then you obviously take it out, says Rashi, and then the rest is benoten tam, because only if it gave flavor to the rest is the rest asur. Ve'im lav, and if it's not, doesn't give flavor. No, so if you don't recognize it, sorry, im lav, if you don't recognize it, kulan asurim. They're all asur, presumably because it's, well, you have like now gidim, and maybe the one you're eating, says Rashi, is the one that's asur. You have many gidim, and you don't know which one is the gid anashe. So that's Rashi that you wanted to read. V'im lav kulan asurin. To kol echad yesh lomar shezehu. Maybe the one, everyone might be the one. And now you'll ask a question. But Gemara parich levat leberuba. The Gemara is going to later ask, but what's the problem? Just let it be batal barov. Because if it's yavish b'yavish, which even though it's cooking here and it's in a liquid, we still categorize that as yavish b'yavish, because one gid against another gid is really just entities versus entities. And then we just count up the entities. And if we have a majority of kosher ones, then it's all kosher. So why are we saying that it's asur? That's the Gemara is going to ask that. And they're going to answer that. And that's going to actually be our Gemara. But back to our Mishnah. Bizman shemekiro b'noten tam. V'im lav kulan asurin, because maybe you're eating the asur one. V'arotev, but what about the sauce? The sauce could still be permitted. V'arotev b'noten tam. But the rotev is only going to be asur if it has flavor from the gid anashe, which again we're going to have to imagine it was basar berlef. And now we go on. V'ken haticha shel nevela, and so too a haticha of nevela. V'ken haticha shel dagat tameh, and so too a piece of treif fish, of not kosher fish. Shenit bashla im hachatichot, that was cooked with kosher meat or kosher fish pieces. Presumably it's min b'mino, right? It's nevela, so it's kosher type of meat. It just wasn't slaughtered properly. Or it's dag tameh, presumably those dag tameh taste just like the kosher ones, or they're the same type. Maybe they're all fish. Presumably it's min b'mino. Shenit bashel ima chatichot bizman shemikiran. If you can recognize it, then throw it out, and then bizman shemikiran b'noten tam. And you take it out, and what's left is permitted as long as it didn't give flavor. Which again, you're going to imagine basar berlef. Ve'im lav, and if you don't recognize it, so then again, kulan asurot. Why? Because again, maybe you're eating that one. So you can't, and we're again having that question, why not say it's batal barov? And then we go on and say, v'arotev noten tam, but the sauce is in noten tam. In other words, the sauce could be permitted as long as it doesn't have flavor, again, probably in that imaginary way. Okay.
So just to make sure that we're on the same page. So the Mishnah is saying that actual flavor is irrelevant, right? So noten tam is more, it's a measurement as opposed to actually giving flavor. Like in
Right. I think this Mishnah, if we could give it a categorization, we might say, how do you assess the kosher status of a mixture when it's impossible to actually taste the isser yourself?
Right. It's not that flavor is irrelevant. It's that, like, when you can't taste flavor, you come up with like ratios or comparisons, right? We still say b'noten tam because that is like kind of our basic paradigm. But when we've been mimino, where we can't be somech on actual tam, we have comparisons that we make.
Right. It's too strong of a word to say it's irrelevant. That's why I said it. I phrased it differently. I said it's just that in a case where we cannot use tam for external reasons, then we use this ratio and imagine. But if we could use tam, then tam is perfectly valid. But the Mishnah is not talking about that.
Right, but even if you have tam, but even if you have tam and it's less than the actual ratio, so then it's not considered b'noten tam.
Say that, I didn't hear you.
if you have tam, but it's less than the actual ratio, so then it's not considered benoten tam. So
Who
assuming
says?
that,
The Mishnah didn't talk about that case.
well, but it seems to be pretty obvious, right?
No,
Because,
it's not
like,
obvious.
noten tam
Don't-
only comes up when there's actual ratio, when there's ratio. But if you have the taste and less than the ratio, so therefore it's not considered noten tam.
Who said? No, nobody said that. You're imagining. That's your idea, but it's not written here. We didn't talk about cases where the ratio. In other words, these are all cases where there is no flavor. It's gid in gidim.
Right, but
There's
it's
no
only
flavor.
considered
It's
noten, it's only considered
nevela
noten
in.
tam
It's
in certain, like,
wait. It's nevela in. It's non-kosher beef with kosher beef. There is no flavor you could ever test. So it's not saying like there is. We're going to allow it even though there's flavor. There is no flavor. When it's min b'mino, there is no flavor. So how do we assess its kashrus status? By imagining, would it give flavor had it been two different species? Had it been two different types? That's not implying that even if it does give flavor, it's permitted. We're not saying that. This is a case where it doesn't give flavor.
no, but
right?
let's imagine a case where you have a very strong flavor and you have one drop of that flavor in something that's batal b'shishim, right? It's not, it wouldn't be considered benoten tam because you don't have the ratio, even though in actuality you could taste it.
So then it's forbidden. It's forbidden. The Gemara talks about that. It talks about pilpel. And pilpel is forbidden in any amount.
That's fair. Sorry.
That's a different case. That's not our case. Our case is where you cannot detect the flavor, and therefore it's as though there's no flavor here. And it's nevertheless going to be assur because we imagine possible flavor.
Wait, is that also true for the questions it's raising about the rotev? I think the rotev, you might be able to detect the flavor, and they're actually concerned about flavor.
You're right. You're right. Rotev is going to be considered a different species, a different type. So maybe by the rotev, I agree with that. Exception. When it says but rotev noten tam, that's saying, yeah, well, the rotev we can actually have a goy taste. You know, we can't taste it, but we can have a goy taste it.
Doesn't it really go against the pshat of the Mishnah? But because when I look at it, so it's clearly like benoten tam, like even the piece itself. Basman shemakiro benoten tam.
Basman shemikiro. What's the relevance of makiro? The relevance of makiro is that since I recognize it, I can take it out.
Sure.
And then the piece is going to be assur. So then
Right,
so the piece is going to be assur, we throw it away.
Yes, sure. But then benoten tam doesn't relate to the rotev because that's stated specifically later.
I'm looking at the last line of the Mishnah.
Okay, no, but it seems to me, I don't know. Well, of course,
Seems like it's referring to the other chatichot.
but it seems to me.
I don't know where you're reading.
Benoten,
You go from v'ken haticha shel dag tamei shenit bashel ima chatichot b'zman shemikiran. When you recognize either the dag tamei or the nevela, then you remove it.
Sure.
And then you're asking what's benoten tam?
Exactly, because it looks like it's the piece which is benoten tam, ve'imlav kulan asurot, ve'harotev, which is a specific.
So let's look at Rashi.
Case.
You have a good point. I agree with you, Alice. You have a good point. Let's look at Rashi. B'zman shemikiran. See, that was a little bit of long Rashi. B'zman shemikiran l'chaticha ha'isser misharin benoten tam. Okay, that was clear. Ve'i ein behen kedei l'teit tam b'shel heter into the heter. Harei hashar mutarot. Presumably, the other hatichot are mutarot. Ve'im ein makiran. But if you don't recognize it, kol hatichot asurot. Right. So if you recognize it, you remove it, and then you measure against the rotef and the chatichot. Agreed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I said it. Yeah.
It's talking about theoretical nitinatan. That's what Lexi was saying at the beginning. The issue with the Gid Hanasheh is maybe that it's the right, depending on what we think the issue is with the Gid Hanasheh, but it's maybe that it's min b'mino. And so the point is min b'mino. There's it. Right. It's a question of whether that piece gave flavor to the other pieces, but you would never be able to tell because they all have the same flavor.
But
right. Look at the continuation of the Rashi.
Right.
Look at the continuation of the Rashi. Wait a second. V'harotev mutar im ein b'chatichot ha'isser kedei l'teit tam b'kol. And now he gives a list. B'kol ha'chatichot v'akifa v'harotev. You're allowed to use the kifa, which is like the things stuck on the sides of the pot, the rotev, and the pieces, all of those to combine together to create a theoretical bittul of the amount of the isser that you threw out. That's what's going on. So yes, the whole broth will be, but in the first part we said if you don't recognize it, then all the pieces are usher, right?
Right. I mean, the pieces are all usher because, again, as we say, any individual piece could be the piece of
It's a
isser.
chashash that you eat
Whereas
right.
we know the amount of isser. So the rotev, which we know is in fact not the gufa yisur, we can measure against the rest of the pieces and the rotev.
Precisely. All right. So the end of this Mishnah is what we're interested in, where it talks about the chaticha among the nevela among kosher ones. And let's go back to our Gemara. And our Gemara is on Daf Kuf. Maybe Raphael, you want to read the beginning of this Gemara here?
Sure. To begin from Daf Tzaditet Amud Bet, from the end.
No. Begin from Ken Chaticha Shel Nevela on Kuf Kuf.
Okay, וכן חתיכה של נבלה, as read in the Mishnah, a piece of nevela, a piece of.
And what about that? What was the din about that nevela?
That it's בשעה שמכירוי בוטה בעינוי סנטם, ובשאין מכירו כל החתיכות אסורות.
Right, and now on that second part that you just said, we ask.
וטיבטל ברובה, it should be cancelled out like in its quantity, exactly as we asked about Gidenoshe.
What kind of quantity?
Rov, I don't like
a numerical quantity, right?
Yeah, numeric.
In a numeric, in other words, if we had like, I mean, let's say, if we had like 3 pieces that were kosher and 1 piece that was not kosher, why are we saying all 4 pieces are kosher, are not kosher? It should be batel because it's 3 against 1.
Yes, there's this Mishnah in Masechet Beitzah. Rashi brings that like the question of quantities, linyan rov, linyan majority, is there is a machloket if it's something that needs to be quanted, like that it's normally quanted by people, or if it's actually something that is quanted, but that you actually give it enough importance that you count it.
Well, let me say it. I'll rephrase it. There's kol shedarko versus et shedarko. Et shedarko means it's only counted. Like for example, maybe this is not the best example, but maybe eggs. Maybe eggs are only sold by the quantity. You know, as you buy 12 eggs, you buy 30 eggs. It's always by a certain amount, it's counted. If you're missing 1 egg, you go back to the store and he'll give you another egg because you asked for 12 eggs. As opposed to things which are sometimes counted, sold by quantity. Like in New York, you can buy a single apple and he'll charge you, $2 for an apple. Or you can also buy them, in other forms, by weight or by a bushel. You can maybe buy a bushel of apples where you don't even weigh it. You just have a bushel, or maybe you buy weight. So some things are sometimes numerically counted, and other things are always numerically counted. So et shedarko is always numerically counted, like eggs, for example. So he says, that would mean some things that are anything that is ever counted by number. So I understand why it's not batel, because steaks could be counted by number. So go on, Ella.
Only things that are actually counted.
That are only counted.
They're only counted, and people can buy steaks in like in a numerical fashion. Let's say. Well, he could possibly answer.
How can he explain the Mishnah?
How could he explain the Mishnah that it's not batel? Right. chaticha, even though it's not a bria, as we said about gidanashe, it's not like something, I don't know, wholesome. It is something that has chashivut. So
Right.
I count it as a entity, even though that it could possibly be I don't know, canceled numerically, because it's something by
even
itself.
though, right, even though it's not important because of the way it's bought and sold, it's important for a different reason because of the way it's eaten. It's eaten as a single item, and therefore it gains importance again. And the basic idea is that things that have extra importance are not batel, whether it's because of the way they're bought and sold or because of the way they're eaten.
It's very similar to Ilchot Shabbat, that like we misharin le'inyan hotza'ah, things that couldn't possibly be sold in such like small quantities, but they have chashivut because like people tend to treat them as chashuv. For example, a very small piece of food, or so on. It's enough to be eaten alone. So like it's chashuv.
Right, like a steak. You might, want to give. If you're having 6 guests, you say, I can't have a 7th guest because I only have 6 steaks. I want to give each person a steak. Okay, so now we're asking a famous Gemara question, sricha, which means, why do we need to teach both? Maybe I can just teach one and I know the other. In other words, why do I need to teach both the concept of counting and the concept of importance?
And
in
specifically,
eating?
it's asking why do we have both a
yeah, I
case
thought
of the
gidanashe,
ghee
Oh, sorry,
and a
maybe
case
I-
of the-
Yeah, maybe I misread that. Sorry. I'll let Raphael read it. I just was
Yeah,
guessing. I was relying on my memory there.
That's why I asked if we should begin from gidanashe, because the Gemara here asked about gidanashe. We could possibly think by reading the Mishnah that the din that there is no bitul berov, it's only in a situation of actually bria. You have actually something that is a gid. It's something wholesome. It's not a piece of
Right.
meat.
In other words, the Gemara is asking the question, why did the Mishnah have 2 sections? It had one section where it talks about gid not being batel, and then it has a section about a nevela not being batel. And why did it teach
And
both of
Bertome.
those? So now it's going to say that gid is, the reason it's not batel is because it's a bria or a biria. Aval chaticha.
Aval chaticha, it's not wholesome enough. It's not that the way it is in nature. So I could say maybe it is canceled by rov. Kamash malan. Yeah, that's v'yashmeinan chaticha oil v'real kabe b'bnei orchim. You could say the exactly opposite about chaticha. If the Mishnah would only teach us chaticha, because chaticha has a chashivus, a real chashivut that I can actually put it before a guest. The gid, okay, it's a bria, it's something very important, but tachlis, it has absolutely no meaning.
Right. So I need to teach both of these cases to teach me basically 3 types. If you think about it, we have 3 types now. Based on this Gemara, we have 3 types of important things. Things that are counted, which was kind of the first part. And then the 2 ones that are brought in the Mishnah, which is things that are biria and things that are important. So we have 3 things that are important enough that they're not batel. And now the Gemara goes on. And this section is really almost could be a 2 dots in my opinion, because it's not really connected to what we just said. But the editors in Vilna didn't agree with me. So here, read on a little bit. Okay, let me stop you. What generation is Rabbi Bar Bar Chana? What time is he?
He's in the generation of the editing of the Yerushalmi, more or less. Like mid-Emoraic.
Yeah, okay. And anyone else have a more meduyak answer? So he's 3rd generation Amora. Okay. So read on. So Darish Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, 3rd generation.
דרש רבא בר בר חנא, חתיכה של נבלה ושל דג טמא, אינה אוסרת עד שתיתן טעם ברוטב ובכיפה ובחתיכות. Rabbi Bar Chana said that the din that we learn in the Mishnah about noten tam in chaticha shel dag tameh or shel nevela actually only works in a situation that the noten tam there works only in what quantity, like what against what are we calculating the noten tam? We're calculating the chaticha against the rotev, the kippah, and the chatichot. Like this huge
Is he
quantity of
talking
meat.
about where the is he arguing on the Mishnah, or is he agreeing with the Mishnah? Or put it this way, is he talking about where the piece is removed, or it's still there?
He's basically in my understanding, basic understanding, he is like it's like he's doresh et to halacha, meaning how do we imply the Mishnah, the Mishnah's din on the mitzvot? What is the noten tam that the Mishnah is speaking about? It's noten tam b'chaticha, b'kipo, and ba.
Oh, okay, nice. And that's when it's mutter, when you remove the isser. Rashi says, in fact, that you remove the isser, and now you have a heter if it doesn't give flavor in all these things combined. So he's basically agreeing with the Mishnah, right? He's just explaining the Mishnah. He's sort of going with the Mishnah very nicely.
Rashi, I think, understands the Mishnah differently. Rashi understands him as being either a cholek on the Mishnah or understanding the Mishnah differently from how Rashi understands the Mishnah.
Really?
Rashi understood I think back on Sadivav.
Here, look here, but look at the Rashi here. Eino oseret. Read the Rashi here for us. Aaron, you can read the Rashi. You see the Rashi where it says Eino oseret.
Right, but on Sadivav,
that's exactly what Rashi said at the last words of Rashi on the Mishnah.
No, on the Mishnah he said if it's
read the last sentence.
The rotev is mutar if it's the chatichot, if there's not enough noten time, if it's not noten enough time in the chatichot.
That's the way I read it. Wait.
The rotev mutar im ein b'chatichot ha'isur kedei latet tam b'chol hachat. Oh, no, you're right. I take it back.
Kol chatichot v'akifa v'rotev. He's exactly the same. Exactly the same. In fact, Rashi learned what he's saying here from Rav Bar Chana. That's how Rashi says what he's saying here. He's enlightening us of what the Gemara is about to say a couple pages later. And then read the next Rashi on our page. Eino oseret. Aaron, you can read that.
Uke Rav Amora Ale.
No, Eino oseret.
Didn't I just read that?
That's what we just read. So sorry, that's all. Sorry. Okay, so let's go back to the Gemara. So we have Rabbi Bar Chana in the third generation saying, basically what Rashi quoted, that you're allowed to combine the pieces and the sauce and the kifa to create a heter. Now read the next part, Raphael.
Uki Rav Morale, Rav brought someone to translate him to the public that could actually like convolate his message, because he didn't want people to actually paskin like him. The Amora is like the person that is transmitting the message to the public, and Vidarash, the Amora, said in the name of Rabbi Bar Chana, Kevan Chenosan Tam.
Oh, wait, in the name of why in the name of Rabbi Bar Chana?
No, the Amora, like translating Rabbi Bar Chana, said so.
No. That's not the way I read
that differently anyway.
No, I don't understand it like that. I understand that an Amora is like a loudspeaker.
Exactly.
So he stood up a loudspeaker. Vidarash, he himself. In other words, either the Amora or him, but it doesn't really matter because they're both agreeing. Rav is getting his loudspeaker to now say for him the following words. He's not talking about. He's arguing. He's disagreeing with Rav Bar Chana. Rashi says, "Okay, Rav Amora le he'emid meturgaman lefanav lidrosh v'lahashmiya l'rabim," to tell the public shelo yilmedu mi Rav Bar Chana, that they shouldn't learn like what Rav they should. He doesn't want anybody to mistakenly follow the halacha of Rav Bar Chana. And
it's like levatel et kol shel Rabbi Bar Chana v'kol shelo.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, I don't hear you so well, Ilana.
No, I just said like literally it's nice because what he's doing is he's speaking even louder to do bitul of the call of his interlocutor, of Rabbi Bar Chana.
Right.
Rav wants to overpower or levatel the other opinion.
Yes. Yeah, so it's sort of, you're saying is we got a bittul going on here of an opinion. Right. So what does
Batel
he?
berov.
So read what he says. Kevan. This is the opinion of Rav, which is said by some anonymous Amora. Kevan. Raphael.
כיוון שנוסן טעם בחתיכה, החתיכה עצמה נעשית נבילו ואוסרת כל החתיכות. The process of the noten time here is like in a moment that one of the chatichot becomes imbued with the flavor of the nevela, it itself becomes as if it was a nevela, and by so it can actually לעשור את כל שאר החתיכות מפני שכולם הם מינה, ומין במינו אינו בטל. So
Right.
like you have like something contagious here. In the moment
Right,
we
so-
actually managed to imbue one of the chatichot with the flavor of the nevela, that's it, the dish is over.
Now, what generation is Rav?
Rav Tano,
Third.
please first.
What? Rav Tano Pali, yes. So what generation is he? Very early. He's the first generation.
First, like,
So how can Rav argue on Rav Bar Chana? Rav Bar Chana wasn't alive when Rav Bar Chana died in Rav died in 247, I think. Whatever. He couldn't have. He basically couldn't have been alive, or he could have been maybe Rav Bar Chana was an infant when Rav was alive. But how is he arguing on this opinion of Rav Bar Chana, who was much later? He's third generation. That was the first generation one arguing on what a third generation one is saying. So I don't have a good answer, except to say that this is probably a case where the Gemara juxtaposed two opinions because they're similar, but not because they are actually taking place at the same time.
Right. It's only like because of Rashi that we think he's doing this dafka to like drown out Rabbi Bar Chana. Like that is like a dramatic setup of the way that this is juxtaposed,
Right.
but like it can also
Exactly.
just this was Rav's opinion and this
And he
is
just
what
one
we should-
day he got up to an Amora and that was it. He just set up an Amora and that we just have a statement that Rav set up this Amora and said, you have this chain reaction. Once it crosses one, then it usses the other and usses the other. So
I don't know, Lexi. It does say Uki Rav Amora Ale Vedarat.
Ale
Like,
could,
it's
what else
not-
could Ale mean?
Rashi's not taking that out of nowhere.
No,
No, it's
Ale, what else could Ale mean?
On himself. It's
Yeah.
really
On
awesome.
the Mishnah.
On the Mishnah.
Like,
in his
Mishnah. But the Mishnah is
He could have been
What?
say-
On
on
the
the Mishnah,
Mishnah?
on the Mishnah, or on this halacha. It doesn't
So
have to
quick
be on
question.
him.
I mean, Rashi says like lifanav. Even if you ignore the rest of Rashi, I think Ale can be like he set up an Amora like essentially to share his.
yeah. 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 Also, he could have argued like with the opinion which was expressed later
By
Rav
somebody
Bar Chana.
before Rabbi Bar Chana. Maybe there's somebody else who was earlier than Rabbi Bar Chana who said this.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's look at what he says now. I don't
Sorry,
know if
just
what he
quick
says
question, just to
necessarily.
make sure that I understand. Is it a machloket, more of a situational machloket? So Rabbi Bar Chana is saying that it's a situation bisman shemakiro, and the Rav is saying, well, it can be bisman shemakiro because once one is nevela, it touches the other one, and all of them are kind of nevela, and we don't know which one is what.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about what Rav says. Let's talk about what Rav says. Rav says like this. He says, once one of the pieces put a flavor, kevan shenatan tam b'chaticha, so let's say the nevela touched one of the other pieces in this broth. There's this broth cooking and there's many pieces and the nevela falls in and it touches one of the pieces. So it's going to forbid that piece, right? Kevan shenatan tam b'chaticha, chaticha atzma na'aseh nevela. So now the second piece becomes a nevela. V'oseret kol hachatichot kulan mipnei shehen mina. Without relating to the mipnei shehen mina, we can just understand simply that it creates more issue. It creates a situation where it's going to be us.
Right. So you
When
can't
we
tell
add
which
in
one
the
is
idea
which.
of mina, it means it's because once it's min, the minnow, according to Rav Yehuda, it's aser b'mashu. And that's what brings the Gemara to say, well, why wouldn't the original piece also create that iser b'mashu? And that's what we're about to see. But the basic idea, what he's saying is that don't be so quick, Mr. Mishnah. It sounds like he's arguing on the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says, what did the Mishnah say? Or this is he's arguing on the way Rashi explained the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Bizman shemikiran benoten tam. The imlat kulan asuri. But in the first part where it's mutter when it's only usher when it's noten tam. And Rav seems to be saying it's always usher.
Right, because there is no situation under which you could tell what is what. Because like
No, you
once
took
it's
it out.
usher-
It could be you took it out.
but
The
yeah,
point
but
is
like,
it forbid one of the original kosher pieces. And now you don't know which kosher piece and you can't remove the kosher pieces.
exactly. So it's not Shemakiran. You don't know what's going on. You don't know which one is which. So therefore, the whole thing is a sword.
Because
It's
of
not
what?
about when it's still there, right? Like the whole, as in everyone agrees that when it's still there, like that's just the straightforward thing of the Mishnah, that when it's still there, everything is usher,
Right.
right? That like this is like, even if I was able to get rid of this kevan shenanatam to another piece, that has become as if it's a new isser, right? It's not that we don't
Right.
know what the initial is; it's as if it has spread its isser and created a new physical entity.
But that's it. You
Right.
create a situation that you don't know which one is which. So it's kind of a chain reaction. Even if you took the first one out, now the
No, but
second one
it's
it
not
becomes
because
Nevilla.
it's not because you don't know it. That's not the main point that he's saying. The main point that he's saying is it became usher, and now it itself exudes flavor into the other pieces.
Right.
And
But what I'm
since they're
trying
all
to-
min, and since it's min b'mino, it's usher b'mashahu.
Right, but why can't we revert back to a situation that's Sheina Makiram, right? Once you transfer the flavor, the first one transfer the flavor to second one, and even if you take it out, now you don't know which one kind of imparted the
Because
flavor.
the second one,
and you have a
because-
situation where Sheina Makiram, and then they're all sword.
So I'll answer you, and I'll say because the other second one that it touched was not Rui Litchabed. Remember, the only reason that the Gemara has already established, the only reason that the Isser is that they're all Usser is because the Isser piece was Rui Litchabed, was a nice big piece. But Rav is saying even if the one that it touches is small and not Rui Litchabed, it's just a piece of goulash meat. So it became Usser, and even though it's not large enough to Usser it because of its size, it is Ussering it because it's min b'mino. And therefore, it's always going to be usher. And therefore, it sounds like he's arguing on the Mishnah, is what I'm saying. Because the Mishnah said, it's mutar b'noten tam. So, Rabbi Bar Chana seems to go very nicely. Rashi quotes him, and that seems to explain the Mishnah. Rav comes up with this other opinion that's basically following the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, who perhaps argues on this Mishnah. I don't think this Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yehuda. We didn't learn Rabbi Yehuda, but I'm telling you that Rabbi Yehuda holds that min b'mino is aser b'mashu. And I don't think the Mishnah can go like it. And I think that's what Rav is saying. Rav is coming and saying, don't paskin like the Mishnah even. And that's why I think the Alei might be referring to the Mishnah. He says he came up and he said this Mishnah is problematic because we all know that we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, who's a Tana. And I think that's what's going on.
So this really is a case of Rav Tana Upalik, like he's holding on the Mishnah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have Shana here. She can tell me if I'm out of line because this is an academic question, kind of. But let's go. But if you don't, but let's go on because the Gemara is now going to ask a question on Rav's opinion. So let me just read a little bit because I want to finish up the Gemara. Mipnei Shehimina. Amalei Rav Safra, what generation is, well, Amalei Rav Safra, who's fourth generation. Abaye, who's also fourth generation. So now they're, a couple hundred years after Rav, and they're saying, Michti, Rav Kaman, who is Rav holding like? And I would even extend this question to say, he's obviously not holding like our Mishnah, so who is he holding like? And Abaye answers, sorry, I didn't read that properly. Amar le Rav Safra la Abaye Mifti, Rav Kaman, Amra, Lishmaite. Did he say his statement? Rebbe Yehuda. It must be like Rebbe Yehuda. Damar min b'mino lo batil. Because he's holding like Rebbe Yehuda, who says min b'mino is lo batil. And then he asks on that. I don't know exactly who's talking here, but maybe that was Abaye's answer, and maybe now Rav Safra is answering. My area. Why, if that's the case, why would it say, quote, ki natan tam, end of quote? Why would it say, why would Rav have said, shenatan tam b'chaticha, haticha atzma? Why would he have said, well, here it says ki natan tam, or it really means shenatan tam. I wonder if that's like the Mishnah.
No, it's like when it has given flavor to another thing.
Right, it's the same thing. Sh and k are the same thing, basically. So, ki natan tam, why did Rav say that only when it gives flavor does it oser? Afilu ki lo natan tam nami. Even if it wouldn't give flavor, it would also forbid. So what is he saying? He's saying like this. Rav said that if the Isser piece gave flavor to one of those little pieces of goulash in the broth, it ushered it, and then that one can usher everything else. But why say that even if it didn't give flavor to the little piece, it would usher it because of its own essence, because of the original Isser one. The original Nevela that fell in, it's also the same min as everything else. It's min b'mino. It should usher everything. So look at Rashi. Afilu lo natan tam. Rashi says, bechaticha de shibitzida lo batel nami daha nevela gufa minayuhi velo batela, because the nevela is itself, it's the same type as the sauce and all the other pieces, or let's say as the other pieces. So it itself is the same type as everything else. It should be enough to usher the whole pot. Why do we have to have this secondary step that it forbids a piece of goulash and then the goulash forbids it? Let it forbid the whole pot because it's all minam. So how could it be holding like Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda would say it's forbidden.
I thought Mishnah was talking about a case where we already picked out the novella itself. So what's the question here? Like the Mishnah talks about a case.
You're right. We're assuming
that it's still there somehow, and then that it has to be batel.
Well, because
and
if
it still means
if it had any however, we could assume that it had some kind of like expelling of flavor, right?
Right.
And
So then no
because,
tantam is relevant.
I mean, that's going to be
well,
the
not
answer.
Not relevant because Rabbi Yehuda thinks that like b'mashahu means is usher. So even if it's an plita that were that like wouldn't be recognizable as flavor, in this case, according to Rabbi Yehuda opinion, it would still be usher because he thinks any amount makes everything else usher. So the residue from the novella piece, even if it was pulled out, would make everything else usher. According.
Okay, what would happen in a case where there's actually no plita whatsoever?
Lexi is saying that even if you took it out, it was still there for a few moments, and while it was there, it should have ushered everything.
Right, because there's something that came out of it.
Yeah, it was there for a few moments, so it should have ushered everything. So actually, the Gemara though answers your question. He says, "Amar le." It's a little bit problematic Gemara because your question seems to be very strong, and then the Gemara says, because of the answer of the Gemara. He says, Amar le, hacha b'mayaskinik shekidem v'salka. Oh, we're talking about a case where you took it out. You took out the Isser, and that's why it's not a problem. But then Lexi's question comes back. But wait a second, it was there for a moment. If it was there for a moment, then it should have ushered it. So you have to look at Rashi, and Rashi does some fancy footwork here to explain this Gemara because on the face of it, it doesn't seem to make any sense. Because what do you mean kidem? You took it out, but it was there for a moment, so it should have ushered everything. So Rashi does some work here, and he says, look at Rashi, V'shekidem v'salko, l'isura. You removed the isura. And look at Rashi now writes, this salak rotev. And you took out all the rotev too. Kodem she'yiten acherot. Before you put in any other pieces. So what's going on here? It fell into the pot, and there was one other piece of goulash there, and there was rotev. Now you took out the Isser piece, you dumped out the rotev, but you kept that one little piece of goulash. Then Rashi says, Kodem she'yiten acherot, b'kedera. But later, when he says kodem shiten achera, but later you do put the other pieces in. And you do put rotev. Hilchach, not tam berishona. It you put flavor into that one little piece of rotev. Harezu chozeret ve'oseret. It will now forbid everything else which you later put in. So Rashi's understanding that it touches the rotev and that little piece of goulash. Then you dump out the big piece and the rotev. Now you've just got that piece of goulash. Now you add in more pieces of goulash and start cooking it. And that's the case. Shekidem v'salko. You took it out, but you thought that that piece was mutter, and you were wrong. And that piece is now going to usher everything. V'lav, and if not, b'may mitasre. And if it, what is ilav? Chozeret v'osartan. And if
I
it
mean,
didn't
if we're
give
not talking
flavor,
about this case,
and if it didn't give flavor, what does it mean ilav? And if it didn't give flavor, if the original piece was not strong enough to give flavor to the little piece of goulash, for whatever reason, it didn't give flavor, then b'may mitasi, then it wouldn't have ushered anything. Then it wouldn't usher the further pot. And this comes to teach us the chaticha atzma nase nevela. And this teaches us that a chaticha can become a nevela even when it was mutter originally. Le'esor chaverte, to forbid its neighboring pieces, bepleitata, in what exudes from it. So what Rav is saying, if you think about it now, let's go back to Rav. Rav is saying that kevan shenatan tam b'chaticha. Now that chaticha is oseret at everything when it goes into a new pot. When it essentially into a new pot, you're essentially starting to cook all from the beginning again. Mechadash, you're starting to start cooking. Now that piece became usher. You threw everything away except for that piece of goulash, and now you start cooking with that goulash, so it will usher. Let's look at Rav again. Where is it? Darash. Kevan shenatan tam b'chaticha. Since it put flavor into that piece, haticha atzma nase nevela, and v'oseret kol hachatichot in some other pot. Mipnei shehen mina. So now it comes out that according to this final explanation, Rav is not arguing on the Mishnah, right? According to this fancy footwork of Rashi, Rav is not arguing on the Mishnah. He agrees with the Mishnah. He's talking about a different case. He's talking about a totally different case. We thought he was talking about our Mishnah where there's everything falls in and it all stays there. No, he's talking about that everything is misulak, everything is taken out. And then you start again. Now, what's really going on in the Gemara? In other words, if we would not have Rashi, that's for another day. Yeah, I mean,
sorry, quick question.
It's a difficult question. How else to read the Gemara? If there's another way to read the Gemara, we're going to see Tosfot. But yeah, quick question.
So is Rabba bar Rav Chana talking about the Mishnah, or then he's talking about the specific case as well? Like, what's the machloket really? So do we have Rabba bar Rav Chana that just explained the Mishnah, and then Rav that comes with a totally different case and disagree with them, or could we say that Rabba bar Rav Chana also talks about this specific case?
Well, the fact that he's sort of quoting the Mishnah, because he says Dag Tameh and Chaticha Nevela, it sounds like he's really quoting the Mishnah. Because that's exactly the two cases in the Mishnah. Perhaps, I mean, I'd have to think about your question to work it out. And I don't have time for that. But it's a good question. It's a good question. I don't, but I want to see Rava. Rava Amar. So now Rava has a totally different take on the Mishnah. Rava Amar, Afilu Tema Lokidem V'Salko. I can explain it. I can explain Rav in such a way that you didn't take out anything. Afilu tema los kidem v'salko have min umino v'davar acher. It's teaching a different thing because this is actually min v'mino v'davar acher. Because you have meat pieces and meat pieces, and what's the davar acher? The rotev. The rotev is like a different type. The call min v'mino v'davar acher. This is going to be a very important concept that Rava says here. Salek et mino k'mi she'eno. V'she'en mino Rava alav mevatel. What he's saying is like this. You might think that if you have a case, let's say, of min v'mino, pieces and pieces, but rotev's there also. So Imagine that the pieces are not there, that it's just the Isser piece versus the Rotev. If the Rotev is enough to mevatel the piece that fell in, of course you're going to remove the piece. But if the Rotev is big enough to mevatel in Shishim, let's say, the piece that fell in, then what do I care that there are other pieces, extra pieces, that are min b'mino? They're not going to ruin the situation. As long as I had enough Rotev against the piece that fell in to mevatel it, then end of story. And I'm not going to say, but there are other pieces in there that are they themselves going to become usser and they're going to add to the isser. There's no adding to isser. Look at Rashi. Even if you say he didn't take it out, it's only going to, the other pieces will only be usher because of the first piece. To call min v'mino could go nevela v'shkuta, right? That's an example of min v'mino. V'davar acher, and could go tavlinim v'rotev, like spices and sauce, which is a different type. Mino de heter, the mino, which was heter, eno mivatlo le'isser. He can't mevatel the isser, that's for sure, because he's the same min. Velo mosifo, but he can't also make the situation worse. Ela salko kamisha eno. Salkehu. Throw him out and pretend he's not there. She'eno b'kedera. Zo. V'nisharu hanavela v'arotev. Now it comes out, we just have nevela versus rotev. Ubatla. Nevela b'rotev v'kifa. It'll be batel in this rotev and the kifa. Hilchach, in our case. That's not our case. That's not what Rav is talking about. Hilchach, in our case, not natam b'rishona. Right? Rav said, Kevan shenatan tam b'rishona, then it is a problem. But if it hadn't given flavor, so what do you say? Hilchach, in our case, not natam b'rishona, if it gives flavor into that little piece of goulash, tchila, ba'od shelo rabba rotev, before the rotev was able to mevatel it, what exactly that means, ba'od shelo rabba rotev aleha, v'achar kach natan mayim b'kifa, and then only later you added rotev. So in other words, it fell in before rotev was added. And now you add rotev. It's true that the rotev is enough to mevatel the yisr. But v'achaticha nitvasef or nitvasfa haticha rishona al hanavela voser. Now I've got two pieces. In other words, if it hadn't forbidden that second piece that was in there, in other words, there's basically what he's saying is this: a piece falls in and touches another piece, and there's no rotev. Now I dump in a whole lot of rotev. So if it would have not touched that first piece, then there would have been enough rotev mevatel the original isser. But now that I have made a second piece usser, the rotev is not big enough to mevatel both of them. It's because they combine together and act as two pieces of isser. And that's what Rav is saying. It put Tom into the second piece, and now I got him about both of them. And they forbid everything. Now the problematic words here are mipnei shemina. We should say, what do you mean? Because it's the same type. Even if it wouldn't be the same type, if it gives flavor, it gives flavor. Why mipnei shemina? But let's just leave that for Tosos to ask. Velo matzu chatichot levatla, and the chatichot are not enough. The chatichot can't help us because they're mina. Maybe that's what Rashi means. The chatichot can't help us because they're mina, and maybe with the chatichot it would have been enough to mevatel both of them. But the chatichot don't help us because we look at them as though they're not there, because they're mina. Because if we would add the varotev levado, varotev levado ein bo k'dei levatel shneim. Right. In other words, if we would keep the other pieces, Rashi is explaining very nicely. If we would keep all the pieces together with the rotev, then we would have 120. We'd have enough to mevatel the original piece and the extra piece. But we can't count the other little pieces because they're mino. So we only can look at the rotev. And the rotev is 60 times the original piece, but it's not 60 times the original piece plus the second piece I got us. And that's Rav's explanation for what Rav meant, that it forbids one and now it joins in and creates sort of more isser, so that when I pour in extra rotev, I no longer have enough. and the other pieces don't help me because they're mino.
It's also worth noting, just for, I mean, a slight spoiler alert, I suppose, but that like this concept is only actually useful in halacha l'maisa as the opposite. That like we
As
end
the
up
opposite.
holding like, yeah, as in we don't end up holding like Yehuda that means mino mashahu, even though Rashi does weirdly, but nobody else does. And so this only becomes relevant when it's actually more makel to have min and mino. So you like say
Right.
like it's mishay with the eno
Right.
mino.
We're going to see when we learn the halacha that we want to try to use Rava's principle in kind of the upside up backwards, the other way around, viewing the min, the eno mino as eno is not there, but that's for later. But just for understanding the Gemara, we basically have two explanations of Rav, where both ones sort of say that the contact between the big piece of Isser and the little piece of Isser was in isolation. Because if it wasn't in isolation, then that's our Mishnah, and we're not arguing on our Mishnah. We're talking about a case where the contact was in isolation, and then later sauce was poured on. In both, whether you're Abaye or Rav, I believe, because Abaye said you removed it, and all you had was the second piece, and now you need to move on to the second piece. And Rava says you didn't remove it, but the contact was still in isolation, and now you need to have enough rotative to move out to both of them. Let's take a break before we get to the Tosfot. So let's take a 5-minute break.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I'll get a drink of water. You can ask. Remember your question. I
Okay.
got it. Let's.
I still have
start
a hard
record.
time understanding, like, where's the, like, when does disconnect from the Mishnah happen? It's like we have Rav Bar Chana that clearly talks about the Mishnah, and then all of a sudden, Rav is talking about something else. Has to be talking about the Mishnah. Like, we can't be totally disconnected from the Mishnah, right? Like, it has to be like some
You
kind of
can
like,
be disconnected from the mission.
What do you mean? There's an Amoritic statement.
well,
why
because he
should-
said okay, right? Like, it comes out against him. It's clearly like it disagrees with him. Rav
Yeah.
Bar Chana is making a statement on the Mishnah. Rav comes along with like some kind of rebuttal, disagreement. So Rav has to be talking about the Mishnah one way or another. Like, I don't think you
Well-
can disconnect.
Well, you're asking a very deep question, because the question is, does Rashi's explanation go back all the way to Rav Bar Chana when he said Chatichasha Nevela V'Shela Eino Oseret? Is he arguing on that? Is he saying, and even when there's a contact, when they're separate and there's nothing else there, I still say you can count the rotav and the kifa and everything against it, even then, and I don't hold by this Chaticha Nase Nevela. If that is, if the explanation of Rav is the way Rashi says it, then Rav Bar Chana, if he's disagreeing with that, must be holding that he doesn't hold Hanan at all. And then you've turned Rav Bar Chana into a outlying opinion. It's difficult. It's definitely difficult. But let's stick to the question that Tosfos asked. So is there somebody? Maybe Sarah, you want to read the Tosfot?
Sure, I can at least give it a shot. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, don't be insulted if I stop you every 2 seconds.
Okay, בשקדם וסקאו את האיסור. ואם תאמר, למה לי שההתיכה של היתר קיבלה טעם מן הנבלה, אפילו לא ניתנה טעם נמי. דהבמינה אוסרת בכל דהו. So the question is, why do I need to say that the chaticha, the chaticha of heter got some of the taste of the nevela that fell in? It seems like even if it didn't do that, and it would just be us where we call the who, and it should be thrown out.
Right. In other words, Rav should have said, since the Isser gave a mashahu of flavor to the heter, like what I'm calling the piece of goulash, since it gave a mashahu to it, it's usher because min b'mino, and now that's usher everything. Why did he go one step further and say kevan shenatan tam? Right? What did he say? Kevan shenatan tam b'aticha. He should have said kevan shenagash, kevan shefilolonatan tam. It's usher b'mashahu. That's the whole concept of if we're in Rabbi Yehuda's world, you shouldn't need to give flavor. which sounds like real flavor, which by the way goes back to last week when Tosfos said that there's a tam that's koldahu, like some kind of other tam. That's exactly what he's saying here also. In other words, he should have just given, he shouldn't have said tam, he should have said something else. He should have said just an infinitely small amount.
Can I just have a question? It will help me. Is min b'mino a Mishnah concept? Because I don't know, I didn't study before. Or is it only later? Does it come up in the Mishnah?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Well, it's attributed to Rabbi Yehuda, who's a Tana.
Yeah. That's true. I know, but I
Right.
just wondered if
And that's a Tanaitic. I mean, that's not.
Sure. I was
Well-
just interested if it's present in the Mishnah
Yeah,
itself. So.
right. If Rabbi Yehuda holds Mino is Asar Rashud, so then he's a Tana, right? Exactly where the Mishnah is, I don't have on the tip of my finger.
I just wondered if it's a Mishnah concept. And then
Yeah.
the second question, probably, which would help me, was: is that clear from everywhere that that nevela is considered a mino?
Yeah, that's the best case of Mino. Other things are more doubtful, like is fat and meat the same min is a little bit more of a question, but nevela and treifa nevela of a cow and a kosher cow is I think is the
This is for
best case.
sure. Okay, good.
In other words, we have a nevela cow and a kosher cow. That's really min b'mino.
In Avodah Zarah 5:8, it has like the thing on Yain Nesach, Yain Nesach Asor, Vaser B'Kosher, Yain B'Yain, Mayim B'Yain, da that one, and it's like Zech Klal, means Mino of Mashihu, Shul Mino B'Noten Tam. And they end up explaining that both, I think, according to the rabbi's opinion and Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbis agree Yain Nesach is Mashihu, but it does, show up in.
So there it is,
the
right? Concept, even though you could argue that shouldn't be applied to the case of foods because yain nesech might be a more machmir.
So honestly, the more
But you're right.
reading of
Yeah. No,
Rabbi Yehuda. But it's not attributed to Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. Like with a lot of the klalot that are attributed to Rabbi Yehuda, where the klal appears in the Mishnah, but him saying it doesn't appear in the Mishnah.
Right. I think.
Min
Thank you.
also it also comes up earlier in this parak when they're citing Mishnah Orla with Truma.
Right. See, these are all cases, if you think about it, these are all cases of things that are usher, maybe as a chumrah, orla, what the issur of orla when in 100 is or 200 is chumrah, and yain nesech also might be a chumrah. It's interesting that that's where it comes up. But here we're clearly applying it to regular basar.
It also comes up in Nachot where dam is not mevatel dam, and therefore it's still, if other dam gets mixed into the blood that has to be sprinkled in the mizbeach, it's
Right.
kosher.
It's still
so
called
also-
dam.
Yeah, so there it's
The
not.
opposite. There it's min. The mino is not is not batel actually. Right?
Yeah, it's not batel, and therefore it's a kosher. So that's resulting in a.
Right. Yeah, that's a famous
that's
case.
Say the
Right.
derivation of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is. We say that derives his neo and batel from the case of the two different dams, but it doesn't show up in the Mishnah. It shows up as like.
I gotta pull a Rabbi Landis and say we're stopping here on this discussion and going back to the Tosfos.
Well, and just the language he uses in the Mishnah or the Braita is ein dam mevatel dam, so it doesn't bring the general rule.
The rule of minu. Okay. Interesting question for research.
Just do a very long.
Let's go on. Back to Sarah.
Okay, Ve'omer Rabbeinu Tam.
So wait, what was our question? Our question was, why does he emphasize that it has to give flavor? Even if it didn't give flavor, it should be asur.
Ve'omer Rabbeinu Tam, Dehi gufa mistara b'chol shehu mikol makom lo amrinan shatasen ve'la la'asur kol ha'acherot kivan shehi atzma lo ne'asra al yadei kol shehu. So I think this is a sort of dachuk explanation, but the answer is that Rabbeinu Tam gives is that if the we don't say that that the chaticha becomes a nevela when it only became asur b'kol shehu.
No, well, no. It didn't become a nevela in every regard.
In every way, yeah. Right. It might become asur, but it doesn't become
A totally equivalent nevela unless it has the actual tam of the nevela in it. In other words,
Well,
Rabbi
meaning it
Yehuda
like it
said-
doesn't have the power to hasser other things. I mean,
right.
which
In other
is
words, he's just
reasonable.
trying to find a place to stop the chain reaction. Or
Yes,
to
exactly.
like, right, to say like, well, you might, or at least to entertain the havamina that you could stop the chain reaction.
He's saying a tremendous chiddush. He's saying tremendous novelty here. He's saying when Rabbi Yehuda says min b'mino is asur b'mashu, he only meant to say that it's asur something else b'mashu, but not that something else that became asur is now asur in the same regard as a normal isur. It stops there. It doesn't have the power to go on.
Right. It's a question of how do you combine the ideas of asur b'mashu and chaticha na'aset nevela.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Well,
you could understand it not as a chiddush, but dafka as like the classical implication of it, because when you say that that it becomes a nevela, you actually need to say that it has enough flavor. I don't know, that actually like there's some like kind of continuity. And when you say also b'mashu, like there's no reason to say that it becomes a nevela linyan lesoachrim. That would be a chiddush.
Yes, I agree with you, Raphael. But I just say it's a chiddush from our perception because we thought Rabbi Yehuda was saying something much more strict. But you're right. There is a certain, there's certainly a lot of common sense to what he's saying, because when something becomes asur, like I'll just repeat what you're saying. When something becomes asur b'mashahu, it has no flavor of that thing. So why should it asur anything further? It has no flavor in it. Only when it has flavor, then it's like then it has enough. Then it has the ability to transfer to something else. But if it has no flavor, so it itself is asur, what can you do? But it's not
When I
going to
was
asur
learning
something else.
when I was learning the Tosfot, I thought about like the parallel on Tumah v'Tahara, that like there are many things that actually become tameh, but they don't become the ava tum'ah. It's very rare that a tum'ah can actually be like transferred
It's mishneh.
completely to a new thing.
I
And
agree
even
with you, right?
sheni, not every tum'ah makes sheni. Like in
Right,
the
you're right.
essence that someone touched by a tameh sheni.
Yes, this opinion is consistent with other things in Jewish law. Yeah, it's not out of this world. But we never would have suspected it unless we had read the Stosis. We would have thought that he meant it's asur. It became a haticha nevela, just like any other haticha nevela.
Right. I
So
mean,
that's-
there's a tremendous narrowing of the principle, right? Which like
which is great because it's kind of a crazy principle. In other words, right? Well, who would ever think that it goes on forever? And so he's saying, it doesn't go on forever. It only goes on forever if it gives flavor.
Sorry, how does that answer the question? And I might be a bit confused.
Well, he's
how
just
does
the
the
only
Benitam
thing,
answer?
the only
cannot
thing that was
answer the-
bothering Tos. The only thing that bothering Tosfos was the words Kevan Shenatan. He would have thought the Gemara Kevan Shenatan Tam. He would have thought that Rava should have said Kevan Shenagab Chaticha. Once it touched the other Chaticha, it made it asur. Then that asured everything. Why did it add the words? It gave flavor to the heter, and then the heter because it can also because the same min. So he explains because that turns it into like super nevela. When it has tam, then it's super nevela and it can create further. But if it only got a negia, if it only had a touching and it didn't actually have flavor, then it wouldn't be a super nevela and it wouldn't asur anything but itself. So he's answering his question. His question was very specific. Why are the words natan tam there? And he
You
explained
could even say that it, right, like it says, Kevan shenatan tam chaticha atzma naset nevela. We could say that it's not naset nevela, it's just asur if without the nitinat tam.
Exactly. That Rav is very precise. Kevan shenatam tam b'chaticha na'aseh nevela. It became actually like a nevela. And if it hadn't given tam, it would have just been asur. Not like a nevela, but it would have been asur. And that's exactly what those are saying. Fits
It's
perfect.
also like part of like how the Gemara, it's very clear from a lot of the discussion here is the Gemara understands tam more as like a siman of interaction between like the substances. So like we have enough of the isu inside now. It's like it actually, when the Gemara says tam ke ikar, it means that like something of the isu is now inside. So when it mitasa bekol shehu mamish, we can't actually say that something of the isu is inside, because even that something isn't enough to become isu. And that's like part of like, it goes to Rabbeinu Ephraim in the like, it's
You're right,
like
agreed.
the isu that is balua inside the chatichat kshera.
Yes, right. I agree with you. Let's go on. That is Rabbeinu Tam's opinion. Now we have Rabbeinu Ephraim, and we have to think about what's the relationship between Rabbeinu Ephraim and Rabbeinu Tam. So continue, Sarah.
Okay, ורבנו אפרים היה אומר מתוך כך, דאפילו כי ניתנת בתם אין ההיתר נעשית נבלה שצריך 60 כנגד כל החתיכה, אלא כנגד האיסור הבולע, הלקח לרב דאמר
הבלוע.
sorry. הלקח לרב דאמר הכה דמין במינו לא באטיל, כשהחתיכת היתר קיבלה טעם מן הנבלה, חשיב האיסור כאילו הוא בעין. ואוסר את כל החתיכות ממש.
So go back. Go back to the beginning.
Go back to the beginning. Okay. So Rabbeinu Ephraim is going to say sort of like around this issue. I guess we'll clarify like exactly in what way in a minute.
Right. Well, my question is, what does mitoch kach mean?
Yeah. I don't have a good answer to that yet.
Okay, so go on.
Tom's opinion. Like it's about the limited power of the initial nevela thing to pass on its status to the other piece.
Well, my ultimate question before, I don't want to answer this question, but my question that we have to think about is he arguing on Rabbeinu Tam, or is he explaining an added, an auxiliary principle which he learns sort of from Rabbeinu Tam?
I see it as an addition.
I think he's not being cholek on Rabbeinu Tam, and then the Ri is cholek on his understanding of Rabbeinu Tam.
Well, I didn't get to the Ri yet, but Rabbeinu, right? That's my question. I mean, I have an answer, but let's just think about that. I don't need an answer right now. So go
Sorry,
on. So
just to understand your question. So how would Rabbeinu Ephraim argue on Rabbeinu Tam? Like the language wouldn't
well,
make sense.
let's first discuss Rabbeinu. Let's discuss what he's saying. We haven't discussed what he's saying.
Okay. So,
my question. Let's discuss what he's saying.
Okay. So
Sarah.
saying even if it had given flavor, the piece of heter would not become nevela because you would need shishim against, or like
no, not because yitztarech shishim. It is not
so
become nevela to the extent that you would need 60 against it. Keneged kol haticha, against all of its volume.
Right. You would only need 60 against whatever absorbed into it.
So let's think of a case. So give me a case. Give me a case.
You have a little piece of
give me
like
numbers.
a chunk of nevela meat that falls in. And it touches something.
A little piece, very good. It has to be a little piece of nevela. Let's say the nevela is 1 kazayah. And it touches what size is a heter? Let's say 4 kazayas.
Yeah. So then some smaller amount. So it touches.
Now we throw away throw away the nevela. Now we throw away the nevela, and we have this 4 kazayats of thing that absorbed flavor from the isser. Now this thing, which has 4 zaytim, it falls into a pot of 60 zaytim. Do we say what's the din? What's the din? That is the question. And
so Rabbeinu Ephraim is saying that we don't need whatever 240, right? 60 times 4. Like, right? We only need 60 times whatever was absorbed, which is presumably some much smaller amount.
Right. It could maximum, maybe I could even say half a zayt. but maximum it absorbed no larger than the size of the Isser.
Then
So
the
if
size of
was
it to
one-
begin with, and yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So if the
exactly.
size
you
of the Isser
wouldn't-
was
you-
one,
if the Isser was one side, and then you had 60, then you would be good to go, because assuming whatever touch was obviously
Right.
less than.
the original Isser was one side. And now the secondary Isser, which is 4 sides, falls into 60 Zaytim of Heter. So it's going to be mutter, because the amount that the 4 Zaytim is Aser, and it Asers other things, which is what Rabbeinu Tam said. It Asers other things when it gets flavored. But he's just adding a proviso. But don't think that it Asers it in against its full volume. Only against the volume of the flavor that it absorbed. And since the original Isser was 1 Zayit, you only need to move out to that 1 Zayit. Now, if we explain it like that, then it sounds like he's totally adopting Rabbeinu Tam's approach. He's just adding one more element to it, which is that, yes, it becomes us so that it can also other things, but not more. And how did he learn that from? Now the question is, how did he learn that from Rabbeinu Tam? How is that mitoch kach? What principle did he adopt from Rabbeinu Tam?
Well, he's just extrapolating from the fact that if it's only becomes User B'Koldehu, then that is not sufficient for it to transmit, such that you would then need to weigh 60 again. Like, right,
Yeah.
what if you
But
thought
if it got flavor,
then what we're actually worried about is that whatever was Balea
is that flavor? In other words, if it didn't get flavor, then there's nothing here to make Isser. If it did get flavor, then it could make Isser. So what's
No,
important?
and I would just add that
Flavor.
it's not a nevela. And that's the key part. It only
It's not
becomes a
a nevela.
nevela, right? And all that
Not
comes with
mamish
it.
nevela.
And that's why it makes sense that if it's a nevela, you need shishim times the whole thing, because it became an Isser entity, like a whole piece of Aser. But if it didn't impart Tom, it's therefore not a nevela and everything that goes with this. What does it mean to be a nevela? It Asers other things. You need 60 times the whole thing. And that also explains why, if it's a drop, why we
No,
don't,
you
why
don't
we
need
do
60
say that
times the whole
Sayaf
thing.
Asar Bechalav.
Wait,
Because-
Shana, I don't understand where you're going, because we're just explaining the opposite. We're explaining that you don't need
No.
60.
Right, exactly. You don't need 60 because if it didn't give taste to it, it's not a nevela.
No, but
that's,
Rabbeinu Ephraim is saying, even if it is an avela, it's not an avela 100%. It's only, you only
No, it's
need.
not a nevela. Where does he call it? Ein haheter nasa nevela. Yeah, it doesn't become a nevela.
No, it does become an avela.
I think it's like
Exactly.
it doesn't
And it
become the
never
kind
will.
of
But it
nevela
might-
that would need 60.
Right. It's not
It never
a
becomes
nevela.
an avela. Right, it never would
almost
become like
nevela.
that.
Right, it's
It would
not,
never
it only
become like
becomes a nevela if it has Tom.
No. He's saying the concept of haticha na'aseh nevela, you misunderstood your whole life. You thought that haticha na'aseh nevela means every bit of it is nevela, but that's not what it means. Haticha na'aseh nevela just means that the haticha is considered in certain ways like a nevela because it can usher other things, but not usher them by its full volume, only by the volume of what it absorbs. That's what he's saying.
I'm not sure that
No,
you
I
can
don't
apply
think
the
he's
concept
saying
of
that.
nevela to it. Yeah, I agree with
He is saying, right, when it does absorb the whole flavor, it's chashiva iser kiluhu be'ein, v'sirkol hatichot.
Because let me read it again. Wait. Even if it does give flavor, so now it's usher, right? It's nase nevela. Eina heter nase nevela in the muvan sheyitztarech shishim. Even though this is the worst possible case, there's no case that's worse than it got the flavor. It got flavor. It was not 1 in 60. It was 1 in 40. It got the flavor, but it's not such a big nevela sheyitztarech shishim keneged kol haticha ela neged ha'isur shabala. only against the amount of Isser that it absorbed. So when you're thinking about something becoming an Avela, you have to know how much Isser it absorbed. This is going to come up in the Shulchan Aruch when, for example, you stir a glass of tea, which had a kazayit of milk in it, and with a spoon. The spoon is now milchik, but it doesn't have more than a zayit of milk in it. Even if the spoon is 2 zayits, it can't have more than 1 zayit of milk. He's saying the same thing here about the chaticha. The chaticha touched a small Isser. It only has the size of that original small Isser of flavor in it.
Right. And
The
I
whole thing, even
think
though we call it
that's
haticha naseh nevela, he's saying, Eina heter naseh nevela, sheyitztarek shishim keneged hakol. It's not an avela that you would need 60 against it, even though it got tam, because there's no such thing as that. There's no such thing as that. There's never going to be a case like that, because this is the worst case. And even here, it's only against the issue that again, he's going to give a case of it. But where's that case going to be? It's later on in the Tosfot by Basar B'Chalaf, but we're not there yet. But by Isser, it only is also to the
Doesn't
extent
even
that
mean
it absorbed
right? And he's
Isser. Sorry, question, comments.
Sorry, are you saying that it's not a full-on novella, just a piece of it is a novella? But how is
Yes.
that even possible conceptually? Because if
It's
the
not a
small
piece of it. No, I never said a piece of it. I never said a piece of it. It is like a sponge. It's like a sponge that absorbed 1 zayit of blood. Are we going to say you need to mevatel the whole sponge, or you just need to mevatel the zayit of blood that it absorbed?
But it would make sense that you have to move out all the whole thing because the flavor that's
I don't
inside
care
the-
what makes sense. I care what he's saying. I don't care what makes sense. I think it does make sense, but that's not an argument. I'm looking at the words here.
I don't know, my understanding of it is that it never
Doesn't matter what
become
your
a novella
understanding
because
is.
the novella, in the words, like a novella needs 60 to be mevatel, right?
The
This is
novella,
not-
original
this is not-
novella,
Yeah, but
Yes,
this is not a
he-
novella because you don't
he's
need 60 to
yes, he's
mevatel.
modifying your understanding. We have to be flexible in our thinking. Just because you thought before this year one thing doesn't mean you should think the same thing after.
No, but it's a different type of isur then. It's not a novella. A novella is a separate category that needs 60 to
Yes, when
mevatel.
we say
In this
chaticha
case-
nas, yes, when we say chaticha naseh nevela, we don't mean it 100%, which is exactly what Rabbeinu Tam said. Rabbeinu Tam said, even though it's oser everything, it's not oser it in the extent that it's going to go further, but it's oser. So too here, it's oser it, but it's like a sponge that absorbed 1 zayit of blood. We don't need to mavata the whole sponge, just the blood that's in it. So I don't need to measure the whole sponge.
So hold on a second. If you were to cut up the part of the sponge that had the blood in it,
No, there's no
technically
part
there-
of the sponge. No. It absorbed throughout.
right?
No,
So the
it
whole
absorbed
thing should be a novella. Like I'm
It
just
is.
very
The whole
confused.
thing is forbidden to eat.
But how much
But the
time?
amount of blood in it, it didn't double. The amount of blood in it didn't triple, didn't quadruple. The amount of blood is whatever it absorbed. It can't be more than that. That's exactly what Rabbeinu Ephraim is saying, and it makes 100% sense. Why should Isser multiply like mushrooms in the forest? It doesn't multiply. It's just whatever it was. Whatever it absorbed is what it is. That is the halacha. That is the halacha, in fact.
Rav Nachum, I think one thing also that might be, I could be wrong here, but my understanding is that maybe Lexi, I couldn't hear if this is what you were saying too, that the opening part of Rabbeinu Ephraim's statement is assuming that there is bitul for mim b'mino, and then he is continuing into Rava's world where there is not bitul for mim b'mino. But that
Yes, this is a very big issue with this Tosfos. Like, is everybody talking about the same thing? And it's not clear. I think that you're right. I think that Rabbeinu Ephraim is talking about our world and not really the world of Min B'Mino Asar B'Masha.
Well,
Or,
he,
you know,
he says that explicitly in going on the Tosfot. He makes
Yes,
the
that's
distinction.
yes. Okay. I'm just saying that's what I think because I have reasons to think what I think. Let's go on in the Tosfot. But my point is, it's the same principle as Rabbeinu Tam, which is that you need Tam with an ayin. You need Tam to create further Isser. So that's why Rav said it gave flavor into the Isser, and that's why Rabbeinu Ephraim says you can't get more than the original tam. If it absorbed only one side of blood, that's it. Even though we call this whole sponge a nevela, it's not really a nevela in every regard. So go on. So now we're at Hilchah. Now he's going to explain. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, you can just tell me that this is a question is not helpful, but by the Tipat Chalav case where they also use this principle, in that like the Isser does multiply like mushrooms, and that's sort of the whole point, right?
Oh,
He's gonna
yeah,
explain
yeah.
that in a moment.
He's gonna explain that.
That's what he's
Yeah.
going to explain. That's exactly the contrast that we need to fully appreciate.
Okay.
So go ahead, Hilchah.
Hilkach l'Rav de'amar hacha demin b'min o lo batil k'she'achat yachat chayter kibla tam min hanvela chashiv ha'isur ki'ilu hu be'im ve'oseret kol achat yichot b'mashehu.
Wait a second. Because Rav is explaining the world. Now when he says Hilchach, he's going back to the world of Rav Yehuda. Since in the world of Rav Yehuda, it's Mashahu, and that's how Rav is holding. Rav is holding Mashahu like Rav Yehuda. So therefore, when it has flavor, it now is able to usher b'mashu the next piece, because that's all you need. Once you got flavor, it's going to usher even a huge piece, even a gargantuan piece, because it got flavor. Aval.
Right, even if we don't think that it like converts to a bigger piece, just the fact
Exactly. Even he holds it doesn't convert to a bigger piece, but it doesn't need to, because once it's a mashahu, that's enough. Aval ki. Go ahead. Now he's going to explain when it didn't give tam, according to Rav.
Right. Okay. Aval lo ki nitnat hanvela tamba.
Aval ki lo natna neve.
Hanvela tamba. Lo hayita useret ha'tichot mipnei shehem mina. So,
Aval ki lo natna nevela tamba. If the nevela hadn't put flavor into the second piece and just ushered it because of this amazing chumrah of mashahu, then in that case, lo hayta oseret hatichot, it wouldn't forbid the other hatichot, because it can't continue on to a second generation or a third generation. Mipnei shehen mina, even though it's mina. Shaharei, go ahead.
Shaharei ein tzarich levatel ela ha'isur levad. The only thing you need to do bitul on is the actual isur and not the like chunk that it has been absorbed in. B'kevan shelo nitna tam b'chaticha have ha'isur kiman delitne delo have ki'ilu hu be'in.
Oh, here he's saying, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says the piece is usher, it's usher, but the isser is not here. It's usher, right? He's saying it's a very subtle point. He's saying, Kevan shalonat natam, it ushered it, but it didn't give flavor to it. So therefore, have isser command deleta. It's the isser is as though it's actually not even here. The lo have ki'iluhu be'ein. It's not as if it's here. And go on. V'lo asar.
V'lo asar ela chaticha rishona she'en ha'heter nase isur v'lo asar shar chatichot.
Right. The heter, when he says the heter, he means the heter part of it didn't become usher. Just the isser part of it. It's like the sponge did not become usher. Just the blood in the sponge became usher. And therefore, well, if it didn't give flavor, there's no blood there at all. It's just usher because of mashahu, so therefore it can't go any further. But Dafka, now here's going to explain
what that part was. Just to be clear, that part was going back and re-explaining what Rabbeinu Tam said once we've said what Rabbeinu Ephraim said, right?
Yes.
Rabbeinu Ephraim is generalized Rabbeinu Tam's case, and now he's going back to the specific.
Yes. Now we went back to Rabbeinu Tam, who's talking about Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbeinu Ephraim is an extrapolation into the world of not Rabbi Yehuda. But now he's going to explain what confused everybody in the beginning here, which is that general understanding that wait a second, everything became nase nevela, nase nevela means it's all us, it's all like nevela. He's going to say, yes, that's true, but don't confuse apples with oranges, or in this case, don't confuse isser with basar b'chalav. Dafka, go ahead, Sarah.
V'dafka gabe tibat chalav amrinan lekaman b'perak labasar the chaticha atma nase nevela v'tzarich shishim k'neged kol ha'chaticha.
Wait a second. Let's stop. So, like I said, I'm going to bother you every 2 seconds. So, this is saying, yeah, but in the Gemara later, which we're going to learn next week, maybe we should have learned it first, but we're going to learn next week in Kuf Chet, he talks about tipat chalav falling on a piece of meat, and then we say that the whole thing is usher, and it's usher in every iota of it. The whole sponge is usher. Wait a second, read it again. Here's a Rav Landis. There you do need keneged kol haticha. Velosagi, go ahead.
Velosagi would be tool but right, and it's not sufficient to just do bitul on the whatever has like
on the little drop
bit
of milk
that's fallen down.
Exactly. Mishum. Now
Mishum
he's going to explain the rationale.
Nafshe share.
What does that mean?
So because each one like has sort of become its own
No, on
like
its own.
little
Each one on its own.
Each one on its own has become it.
No, not has become. Each one on the own was originally mutter.
Was originally mutter on its own and now is like kind of understood.
On its own, shari. Each one, they were two headers. Milk is
right.
In other words,
each one is on its own is shari. Right. Each one is mutter to start with. So there's no the isur is only them coming together, and so that somehow.
Keep on reading. Keep on reading.
Right? But
when they join, usher.
Right, but I don't understand why that is a sufficient explanation. Like,
yeah, I'm gonna explain it. But go on a little bit more.
Okay, Hilka chabasar atmona say isur viloka imachal chetzi zayit mimbasar v'chetzi zayit michalach.
Now, each one is totally usher. If you eat a half a zayit of one, half a zayit of the other, you eat a zayit of isur, you're gonna get with. Hilcha, okay. Hilcha tzarich berotev shishim levatel kol haticha shenafal alei tipat chalav. So what's the idea? What is the connection between the fact that they were mutter to making everything else? Because I'll explain. It's very simple. Because by the sponge case and the blood being absorbed into the sponge, so you can ask the question, how much blood is in it? And that's how much it's usher. But if I would tell you that when sponges and blood meet, when sponges and let's say olive oil meet, they become usher. So it's irrelevant how much olive oil went into the sponge. The sponge joined with olive oil, the whole thing is usher. So it doesn't matter that I can't ask the question, how much olive oil? As long as it was enough to give flavor to the sponge, then the whole thing is usher. Kind of like shatnez. If you have a huge baguette with one strip of, it's wool and one strip of linen in it, one little tiny crumb, the whole baguette is usher, even at the other side of it. Because when two things join together, they create an isser, and that isser isn't because an isser joined it, a heter joined it. You can't even ask the question, how much isser is in this basar v'chalav? It's how much chalav you could ask, but chalav is heter. What we were asking is how much isser is in it. So we can ask that, we can answer that question. But here, there's no isser in it. It's only the fact they joined together, and then magically, or al pi halacha, they both turned into isser. So the whole thing is isser. So I need to move out to the whole thing. That's very different from a case, and that's what I'm about to say. So read on now where you just stopped. That's very different from our case.
Right. לבטל כל החתיכה שנפלה עליה טיפת חלב, אבל חתיכת היתר שבעלה טעם נבלה ונאסרה וחזרה וניתנה טעם ברוטב, אין צריך אלא 60 לבטל האיסור שנפלה בחתיכה, ואין צריך שיעור 60 של אותה חתיכה.
אין צריך שיעור 60 נגד אותו חתיכה. הלכה למעשה. Hanan does not mean that the whole thing becomes usher. Well, I don't know halacha l'maisa, but let's say halacha l'maisa for now, just to make the point more strong. Certainly halacha l'maisa v'ya Shulchan Aruch. Certainly halacha l'maisa v'ya Shulchan Aruch. It's logical. Just the isser, you can ask the question, how much isser is here? And that isser I need to move out. Questions, comments, arguments, refutations.
Do you hear me? Okay. So I wasn't sure. I wondered, Rabbeinu Tam, is there a difference between Ta'am, in the case of Ta'am, between Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Ephraim? Because it seems to me, I don't know, but it seems that Rabbeinu Ephraim says that Rabbeinu Tam says that if there is Ta'am, it would change the situation, while Rabbeinu Ephraim says, no, even if there is Ta'am, so you're still mevatel only the Isur Balua in the Chaticha.
No, but
You
he
are right.
agrees. No,
Rabbeinu
but
Tam would explain that as saying that like he's talking about the Gemara where like we're talking about Min Mino Oser Mashahu, the Rabbi Yehuda, right? That like Rabbeinu Ephraim, if he wanted to make Rabbeinu Tam agree with him, would just say that that's like Dafka Min B'Mino, right? Whereas Min B'She'eno Mino, or if us who believe means Mino could be Batel, then it would only be the Isur Balua that's relevant.
Yes, right, exactly. In other words, what Rabbeinu, Rabbeinu Tam was talking about was explaining the Gemara, and the Gemara was only lefi shitat Rabbi Yehuda, and that's what the Metoch Kach comes to say. Rabbeinu Ephraim is coming and he's turning the Tosfot into a halachic Tosfot, which is that we, according to Tosfot, we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. But he's still trying to learn. But so he's talking about a different case where Tam is enough to usher something, not just Mashu. Mashu is not, Mashu is not enough, but Tam is. But he's adding to that like a proviso. Don't think that just because it became usher because of Tam, that it became entire. That the whole thing became.
Yeah, sure.
So they're talking about different cases. You're right. See, what you said is correct. That according to Rabbeinu Tam, Tam changes things. It makes it go on. And according to Rabbeinu Ephraim, well, Tam also makes it go on, but not infinitely, and only 60 against the original amount that it absorbed.
Okay.
Well, this is actually a good. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering how far we could take Rabbeinu Ephraim, right? So it basically says that we calculate 60 according to like the balua, right? To the amount that it absorbed. What about the rest of the meat? Could you calculate it in the 60 to be mevatel this davar balua? How far could you take it?
That's a very interesting question. A very
like
interesting
the rest
question.
of the meat, the chaticha. Right?
In other words, you're not asking whether the other piece will ever become mutter. That would be a different question, which is called efshar sochto mutter or not. But you're not asking if the sponge is still going to be usher because it one time absorbed blood and we don't know where the blood is and it's spread everywhere. But you're asking a different question. You're asking, can we use the sponge to help us in creating our 60 against the original blood that it absorbed? Now the sponge fell into a soup, let's say. Can we use the sponge also to create our 60? It's a very good question. I believe the answer is yes, actually. But it's a very interesting question. Logically, yes. No, I mean, not necessarily. What would be the argument to say no? The argument to say no would be it got shame Isser. This is it got shame Israel, even though it doesn't have more than a Zayid of Isser in it, but the whole thing has shame Isser. So we have to treat it as though it's neutral. But I believe the answer is not right. I believe the answer is
the shame.
Lexi, what do you want to say?
The shame Yisor would be the reason to say Ashar l'sochto Asor. But that in and of itself would not be enough reason to say we can't use what was initially the goof of the heter there to mevatel the balua iser. Like I do think we end up, if I recall correctly, we end up holding that it can be combined to mevatel.
Well, that's what I said. That's what I said. I'm just trying to think of a possible. That's what I said. You're right. It does combine. I'd like to see if you can find that in the Shulchan Aruch. I can't recall offhand where that is. But yeah, I think it is going to join with the heter. Which is pretty shocking.
Or just the whole thing, or just the original mass minus the mass of the stool that it was in contact with, that it got Tom from?
you're right. It is getting complicated. If we're going to say that, right, then maybe, well, wait a second. It weighed a kilo and it absorbed it with kazayit. So, do we say we can add maybe a kazayit? And now it still weighs a kilo. It still weighs a kilo. So maybe we have to remove a kazayit from that
It
kilo.
already
Yeah,
had
it's a kilo
effect.
minus the
Already
kazai.
was, like,
Kazai is
partial.
dispersing amongst the kilo, right? So the kilo is working to already dilute that kazayit of Isser.
I mean, the ultimate question is going to be, do we view it in stages? If it happened all at once, then for sure the piece helps. If it fell onto the piece in a pot, it was all cooking and bubbling up, then for sure. But you're asking, there was 2 stages. It became Aser, and then it falls into another pot. Anyway, we'll stop here for today. These are really good questions. We really got an excellent point here. This is the famous Shitat Rabbeinu Ephraim that actually gets understood to be it's rephrased incorrectly, sort of, as Ein Hanan B'Shar Isurim. That's the way this Rabbeinu Ephraim is understood in later poskim. Ein Hanan B'Shar Isurim. In other words, B'Basar B'Chalav Yesh Hanan, but B'Shar Isurim Ein Hanan. Rabbeinu Ephraim clearly says there is Hanan here. He just defines Hanan in a different way, that it doesn't create more Isser than you originally started with. And that's the way the Shulchan Aruch is going to paskin. We'll see later that the Ramah has a Chumrah on top of that. Okay, Shukayach to everybody. We didn't do the whole Tosfos. I kind of suspected that would happen, even though I really did want to do the whole Tosfot. The rest of the Tosfot just delves into more details of the same thing. It's not, you really got the main point of the Tosfos from where we were. Okay, so Laila Tov. Next week we'll do
Laila Tov.
Kuf Chet. I'll send out more details about that. But it's a Mishnah there, Kuf Chet, Amud Aleph, Tipat Chalav. And we'll talk about that.
Shkoyach.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, Rabbi.